I consider myself an international relations scholar. I self identify that way. And that is despite a lot of the outcomes that I am interested in my research, like civil conflict, are often domestic level phenomenon. And the reason why I consider myself an international relations scholar is because I'm fascinated by how international markets, international organizations, international state and non state actors can have a huge effect on the individual lives of people in developing and developed countries around the world. And this came about from travels in a lot of these countries and seeing firsthand how in the 21st century we are a global village and that there is a huge cultural, social, media, political, economic connections that bind us all together for better or for worse. We all are one family stuck together on this planet, and I think we recognize and forget that at our peril, and depending on our situations and our ability to insulate ourselves from it. I think the pandemic since March of 2020 has really brought home the difficulties that states face when they try to pull back some forms of connection while still relying on others like food and resource extraction. So I want to connect the often domestic level focus for the first part of today and start mentioning a couple of international efforts to try to reduce the resource curse and increase the possibility of stability. Now, there is a more and less savory way that the international actors can get involved in a lot of these states. I mentioned Saddam Hussein earlier and their invasion of Kuwait in 1990 and the first Iraq War in 1991. What often people don't talk about, especially from the U.S., was the fact that the U.S. wanted to reach out and help support the Iraqi regime's fight against the Iranians because of the Iranian Revolution in 1979, bringing into power a theocratic government that was antithetical to previous U.S. cozy relationships with the Shah and with the Iranian leadership. So you see the top photo here, Donald Rumsfeld, who later became associated with the Second Iraq War as the defense secretary. Here he was meeting Saddam Hussein as the president of Iraq to try to encourage closer ties and oil exports during the 1980s under President Reagan. There's a long history of international companies and governments funding repressive states and armed groups, in part, though not entirely, to extract resources from them, often with side payments. There are a number of international organizations that have paid side payments, bribes, slippage, whatever you want to call it, to leaders in developing countries. Some of them actually are brought to trial, like these three leaders in the snapshot below from the French oil company ELF for their role in destabilizing Congo-Brazzaville and payments to the leadership there. When I think about corruption and relating to natural resources, I think one of the most dramatic examples is also one of the longest serving leaders in the world today, and that is of Equatorial Guinea, a small country in the western part of Africa. A lot of these examples come from Africa this week because they're the examples that I know from my own research the best, that you can make similar arguments about the Spanish extraction of silver from the Potosi mine in Bolivia going back centuries, or the Brunei and the effect that it's had on the leaders' wealth there from oil production in Southeast Asia. You can anywhere there are these kind of large resource production, or the tension between China and their neighbors with the South China Sea, with the possibility of production there. So there's a lot of tension. Just a lot of the examples I mentioned are from Africa because it's the region I know the best and have some of the most dramatic examples since independence in the 1960s. getting back to Equatorial Guinea, you see a pretty dramatic decline of gross national income on a per capita basis with purchase power parity. We've talked a little bit about that in the first couple of weeks, but it basically is making their income comparable to what things actually cost in countries around the world. You see quite a dramatic decline, and that is despite the fact that the political leadership has taken an enormous amount of resources, economic resources, resulting from exports of natural resources over the last 4 or 5 decades since the president has been in power. His son being raised from in Los Angeles. This connected to me because it focused on Maui. I used to live in the same area in which Michael Jackson's compound originally was in Encino, in Malibu. The Teodoro Obiang had to flee the country and give up some access to his resources in the U.S. because of what initially started out as a complaint by one of the people who worked there, the working conditions. He did get to keep Michael Jackson's gold glove, but clearly the people, and if there's a whole YouTube rabbit hole that you can go down, the life of the political leaders and their children in resource producing countries. One of the recent tensions in the U.S. with the ongoing effort to subvert Russia's efforts in Ukraine was deciding who to sanction. And recently, I think the U.S. did finally sanction President Putin's daughter, to the extent to which family members are related or can benefit from some of these resources. In the South Sudan's report, it showed the extension of how involved the family was. Here in Equatorial Guinea, it's also the case. I think the son is being set up to be the new president, in a similar way that Turkmenistan's leader was back in March. But I mean, it's just a whole host of examples to the extent to which these resource-dependent countries have an incentive to create politically stable systems in which those that have personal connections to the leaders can maintain economic and political control within the country. And I could think of a whole host of other examples. These are just some of the more dramatic ones. And it connects to these kind of foreign direct investments that occur and cluster in Equatorial Guinea, but then also in South Sudan. I see a number of projects there in my data project that I'm looking at, foreign direct investment in areas of political instability, but then also in the eastern part of Congo with their natural resource production as well. So a lot of the foreign direct investment that goes into extracting resources in Equatorial Guinea also flows to a number of other regions in the country. I showed you those dots. Each one of them was a new FDI project. A lot of them are resource related. Some of them are cell phone efforts, as I mentioned earlier. But the FDI has really skyrocketed since the end of the Cold War. Again, I'm leery talking too much about economics in this class. I understand some students don't want to kind of focus on that side of it, but it's really hard to overstate the amount of resources available and the interests of international conglomerates and governments to be able to secure access to emerging markets that stand to benefit from the resources that developed countries want to give them, that are refined, that are manufactured goods, or use the raw materials, process them, and then sell them back to these developing countries. But also the effect that these investments can have on raising those resource rents that I talked about earlier. And this foreign direct investment of these international corporations for oil production or otherwise actually exceeds the amount of foreign aid that's given to a lot of these developing countries, which goes to show you the extent to which there are these two relations that these states can have with developing countries. One in which it's more giving aid due to absolute need, and the other one is through investment, in which theoretically the investments would be there due to the market mechanisms for a longer and more sustainable time period than foreign direct than aid. So those are some of the less savory, challenging relationships between different states. Some of the more Savory, I defined savory loosely there, but ones that were geared towards increasing transparency and making sure that people in the countries benefit more from the extraction of resources from their territory. So you have Security Council efforts of trying to increase transparency, World Bank, other international organizations, which we're going to touch on in a second, but then also non-governmental organizations like Publish What You Fund, that are efforts at trying to increase transparency, with the idea that transparency should theoretically allow stakeholders domestically as well as internationally understand where the money is going, have a better ability to lobby the government for distribution of those revenues that should benefit a greater number of people than there would be if there wasn't transparency. Though in the workshop, we're going to get into the potential downsides of transparency. One international effort at trying to systematize this transparency, Publish What You Fund, is a non-governmental organization, would be the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. Yes, they have a Twitter account, and what they do is they provide guidelines for international corporations as well as governments to try to increase transparency of the resource revenue, with the idea that that should be able to decrease corruption. You can see states that are full members, candidates that are part of this resource effort. You do see some notable absences here: Saudi Arabia, South Africa, Australia, China, Russia, some big exporters. Often these kind of initiatives provide incentives for some smaller states, like those that we've touched on in this class, though I don't see Equatorial Guinea in there, to help reduce corruption within their states, to commit the governments to try to build the capacity to regulate where these revenues come from. EITI was actually created in 2003, so relatively recently, just within the last 20 years, to promote open and accountable management of natural resources. They currently have 56 implementing countries, with 31 further countries compliant, with 31 out of the 56 that are compliant with fully compliant with the standards. So they're working on it. Some are making progress, some are making less progress. This map is a bit dated. Peru was actually suspended for inadequate progress recently, but you can delve into these data like we've done so far in the class, regardless of the issue. I think I've been amazed as a researcher how many other people are trying to get information to, and the ability to share it around the world to try to increase transparency. And I think one question is, why is transparency so important? I think we've established some relationships relating to corruption, resource rents, and distribution, but I think I'd kind of switch now away from oil production to talk about other things that are dramatically smaller. I mentioned diamonds a bit earlier, right? And that diamond that was worth almost 3.5 million Australian dollars, that diamond that's worth millions of dollars could be easily put into a small bag and carried across international borders. $3 million worth of oil, not able to fit in any small bag. And trying to find interesting examples of diamonds that play into relations between countries over time are a bit easier than oil production. Oil production wasn't really relevant until the turn of the 19th century to the 20th century, but diamonds have been something that societies have valued for millennia. The Cullinan diamond, I don't know if you've come across this in any of your other classes so far. It's the largest gem quality diamond in the world. When it was discovered, over 3,000 carats. It was discovered in 1905 in South Africa. Its value was estimated at what is now $2 billion US. So you could put in a handbag something worth $2 billion. That absolutely blows my mind. So this one large stone was broken up into a number of smaller stones, polished and cut. I don't know if any of these start to look familiar to you, whether you've been to London in recent years, been to the Tower of London. But the larger one was actually 530 carats and was put into a very fancy stick, the Sceptre with the cross. You're probably getting an idea of where I'm going with this. The Sceptre of the Cross is, of course, a symbol of the British royalty, and Prince or Queen Elizabeth carried it at her coronation in 1953. You can kind of see it there. That photo's a little bit blurry, but it is a resource found in an incredibly developing part of the world that was exported, refined, hugely increased in value, that is now a symbol of a previous what was then an empire when they discovered it in 1905. It is typifying those kind of international connections in the export of value from developing countries. Where, as part of this developing country, did it come from? It came from this gigantic hole in South Africa. It came from the Cullinan mine. It was called the Cullinan diamond because it was founded in the Cullinan mine in South Africa. The mine is currently 747 meters deep, according to the information that I was able to find, and that it can theoretically go and is on its way to going 1 kilometer down. That mine is pretty impressive. I mean, you don't really fully understand the scale of the hole in the ground until you see the size of the houses and the buildings around the area. They do have tours there. If you're ever in South Africa, you can take a tour to the Cullinan mine. And what's interesting here from this map is how close it is to the nation's capital, that you do occasionally have hugely valuable natural resources produced quite close to centers of power, as opposed to the Democratic Republic of Congo or the South Sudanese example that I mentioned earlier. And with that huge hole in the ground, that took a lot of industrialized, expensive machinery to be able to take that material out, to be able to be looked through in order to take out those diamonds that had value. Contrast that with a different type of diamond mining in Sierra Leone, tying it to that Kanye West video that I have in the playlist for today, and an old Leo DiCaprio movie, if you ever have time to watch it on Netflix, connecting diamonds to the instability and the civil war in Sierra Leone. Here you have alluvial diamonds that basically get washed up through the natural processes of geological change, in which you pretty much don't need any of that kind of heavy industrial machinery of kimberlite mines that are related to production of the kind that you see in the Cullinan mine, and that you also see in neighboring Botswana, another example of a democratic society that's benefited a lot of their citizens, that's been stable since independence, that have been able to export diamonds because of the industrialized nature and concentrated nature of the production. Sierra Leone, you can produce it by hand. Rebels control a diamond producing area that is in the periphery of the country near the border, and you have a recipe for natural resource exploitation and incentive to gain control over those strategic areas to be able to get the resources. Diamonds are easy to smuggle abroad. That can bring you the money to be able to continue your fight. And so I think one way to try to increase transparency with oil revenue, those kind of large natural resources, the EITI was kind of geared for that. For diamonds, a separate international effort was created, the Kimberley Process. You might have heard of that so far. It also was launched in 2003. Its efforts were geared towards reducing the instance of conflict diamonds. A diamond, kind of like the gold in my ring, is impossible to really trace, find out where it's from, to decide whether it is a blood diamond coming from a conflict region at all. What is a conflict diamond? The definition here is rough diamonds used by rebel movements to finance wars against legitimate governments. It only applies to rough diamonds, not refined, because after they've been refined, it is even harder to trace. They have a certification scheme which outlines the rules that governs the trade in raw diamonds. As of 2013, there was 54 participants representing 81 countries, with the EU representing one government. They represent almost pretty much every major diamond producing country. However, it has been more subject to critique than the EITI, and I think why the EITI is growing, Kimberley Process is less so. The non-governmental organization Global Witness suspended their collaboration in 2011 due to criticisms that they had about the effect of regulating the export of diamonds to actually having a meaningful effect on conflict. They produced a lot of really interesting reports on diamond production in developing or conflict regions that I would encourage you to take a look at if you're interested, and also other resources, including agricultural ones like cocoa or timber resources, to show how non-traditional natural resources can also be associated with corruption, environmental damage, and connections to conflict. So I think the Kimberley Process is another international effort to try to regulate these factors to reduce the resulting conflict. However, there are difficulties due to the number of different actors involved and the high economic stakes in maintaining control of these scarce and valuable resources. So with that, I'm just going to conclude now briefly by kind of bringing it back to the initial motivating question: how do natural resources affect countries' political and economic stability? The short answer would be that the political stability is increased quite dramatically by a reliance on natural resource exports. Economic stability less so, given the price fluctuations and the dependence on resources and the difficulties in diversifying the economies away on a reliance on one resource, as we saw with South Sudan, but also the stability of autocratic systems that resources enable make it more difficult to transition to some democratic or anocratic systems. And if they do go through those processes, those anocratic systems would also be at increased risk of conflict due to that change. There's a lot of mechanisms by which natural resources can affect political institutions and stability, as we covered before. And I think we really have to be, if you're interested in this topic, be concrete about what resource you're looking at, what mechanisms you think are involved, and what actors are related to those specific mechanisms. And there's been oil is definitely seen as having the most dramatic effect on resources relationships to political stability. There's been a bunch of international efforts to try to increase transparency with mixed results, and there's uncertain findings as to what effects they do have on political and economic stability. So it's an incomplete picture. It's one in which falls in and out of fashion. The natural resource and conflict relationships were much more talked about 10 years ago. There was a talk around the turn of the century of peak oil, that the demand is just going to outstretch supply, or that there's going to be new resources coming in, and that these dependent states are going to have to find something else to produce. What's unsure is what's likely to happen in the future. What we do have is established records on the often pernicious effects of natural resources on conflict. And so with that kind of pessimistic conclusion, hopefully you have a more realistic picture of the direct and indirect relationships between natural resources and conflict. I will end today. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.